Hello, good morning, everyone. This is Sachin Gaur, your host on behalf of NORA today, and a very warm welcome to all of you, and also good evening and good afternoon to people joining from different time zones. Today we have a very special webinar because it's not just a webinar; it's actually kickstarting an initiative. It's called NORA AI Hub, and we have chosen a timing which is actually a lunch time. So some of you may be even having lunch while listening to some of these conversations. The idea is to do this as a community effort, and maybe post covid we'll also find to have real lunch, not just the virtual lunch. And to kickstart this initiative, which we are calling as NORA AI Hub. Today we have a very good opportunity to have Mr. Sabri Razik, who is a senior engineer from USIT, UIO, and he would be sharing the background about this AI Hub. So, Sabri, can I request you to share your screen and maybe say a few words about the vision behind this initiative?
Thank you, Sachin. Can you see my screen and hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm a senior engineer at the University of Oslo, IT department, specifically Department of Research Infrastructure. So we provide infrastructure support for researchers. We also provide support for the Norwegian high-performance computing systems. If you have heard of them, Saga, from Betsy, those systems. In addition to that, I'm representing here our machine learning group at this seminar, where me and Jürgen, who will talk a little bit later, are working on providing infrastructure and support for users who want to use machine learning and artificial intelligence research and educational work. So AI Hub is quite, it's not a new thing. It's started some time back with experimental infrastructure, specifically trying to use low-cost GPUs for research purposes. In addition to an AI launch initiative where researchers got a chance to share their knowledge, community building, and also we had invited experts in the field to hold talks. It has been progressing since, and since January we have gone into a production system from our experimental setup. This will be officially launched in June, but we have been running pilot projects since January. So main task would be to provide computational infrastructure for researchers and students, especially the ability for the students to access their labs from home during these pandemic situations, so where they can't attend the labs. We also provide support for data storage and sharing. And we also install the software that we need, they need in an optimized way for the infrastructure. We also provide user support for our users. So we have now about 32 GPUs running at the moment. In different flavors, NVIDIA, the ray tracing low-cost GPUs to up to NVIDIA V100 GPUs, and also one AMD machine. We have about 200 users at the moment. We have already completed during our project pilot project 2 courses, participating around 100 students each. And the next phase, the soonest thing that will happen is we will hold some courses, which not only the academics, but also the SMEs, the small to medium scale industry, and also the startups could participate. For this, we have some cloud collaboration being planned. In addition to that, we have purchased some machines with more high-end GPUs like A100s in media. And also we'll be opening up our high-performance computer cluster, which is named Fox, very soon. So all these things will come into place, most of it before June 1st and others by the end of June. So we decided to move our the AI hub, the place where people meet, and also the course arrangement to NORA, because NORA was best placed as an umbrella organization at the moment that they could facilitate a wider community than we do at University of Oslo. So we have started this collaboration. And as the first thing, we are holding this AI Hub seminar, and we are also organizing an NVIDIA deep learning course together. And then UCIT will provide the infrastructure, hardware, software, and the support, and the NORA would perform the advertising, user management, and coordination, addressing wider community. So that's a brief introduction to our services. These are contact details. But most probably the people who are attending this seminar, most probably you would interact through the NORA instead of directly to us. So that should be our long-term plan. And I guess Klaus would give you more details about it. And I'm handing over to you, Sachin. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabri. That was so nice of you, and to show the trust and faith in NORA, and also your spirit of extending these wonderful services to wider community through NORA. And I think nobody could do better job than extending this vision than class, our own class, which most of you are probably familiar with. So class, over to you, and maybe share your point of view on this initiative.
Thank you very much, Sachin, and thank you also to Sabri for a very nice introduction. I used to actually follow the AI Hub, UCIT AI Hub seminars when they went physically before the corona, and they were great. And it was such a pleasure when Gard, Sabri, Jørgen here asked us to host this and to bring this further out to the community, because NORA is all about community building. We do have an outreach in Norway, which is quite substantial. And it's so nice now to see that many of these pieces are falling together. And from now, this AI Hub will be kind of a national initiative from UCT of them. So I will just say thank you to Gard, Sabri, Jørgen for bringing up this initiative. In NORA, this will fit very well into other things we're doing. We do have for innovation a NORA startup ecosystem, which may also take advantage of this and joining the webinars, I hope. We do also build up a national research school, which may also take advantage of this, because what you're doing now at the University of Oslo is to open up a platform so that users outside the University of Oslo also can access this. As Sabri said, from the 1st of June, it will be possible to access their systems and their infrastructure, also for without an UEO account. So I think this is a great initiative. I will just say thank you, and NORA will do its best to kind of build up the community in Norway and to make not only this AI hub a success, but also to integrate it to all other activities that we do have in NORA. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, class. And I really hope that at NORA we keep pushing boundaries, and with this initiative of AI lunch, or we also probably in future see physical lunches, as you mentioned that they were prior to COVID were physical meetings. So we have an agenda for today, which is a very wonderful presentation lined up by Jørgen. And Jørgen is someone who has just got his PhD. So freshly minted PhD from UIO, And as a way of his introduction, I think it's also mentioned that because of his PhD, he has now joined UCIT. And I think Jorgen is a person who is probably interested in all tech topics. But for today, I think we are going to hear from him about his core work area, which is evolutionary robotics, and maybe the context of high performance computing. And we have a little problem today. I think Jorgen has some issues with the screen sharing. So I would be running the slides for Jorgen. So Jorgen, over to you. In the meantime, I am sharing your slides.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, Sachin. So I hope everyone is having a nice lunch. And today I'll be talking about evolving modular robots from the ground up in an HPC environment. And this will, of course, not cover everything about evolutionary algorithms and modular robotics, but I hope that you get a cursory understanding, at least, of evolutionary algorithms, why I like them so much, modular robotics, what's so fascinating about that particular area of evolutionary robotics, and lastly, how high performance computing can come together with evolutionary computation to give us these interesting results that we'll see during this presentation. If you can go to the next slide. Thank you. Yeah, so Sachin basically said all of this for me already in a much nicer way, but I thought I'd just mention that I have some background in the topics that we'll discuss today. Hopefully the presentation will stand on its own and you'll think that it was a good presentation on its own, but I would say that I have some knowledge about this previously. And what we're doing also at UCIT, I thought I'd just mention, is that we're also helping researchers get the most out of the resources. And that's my current position, where I work in helping researchers get GPU compute. And so the agenda for today is we'll look a little bit about what evolutionary algorithms are all about. I'll give you a brief introduction to the key topics in evolutionary algorithms. I'll talk a little bit about why I think evolutionary algorithms are so very fascinating. I'll introduce the topic. I've just called it surprise, ... here. And once I show you the examples, I think you'll see why. It's really fascinating. It's really frustrating as a researcher, but also highly fascinating. We'll then transition over to modular robotics. I'll talk you quickly through what modular robotics is, and then I'll present some of my research and why I find that fascinating, and hopefully why you will find that fascinating as well, with a little bit about how I did that during my PhD. Then lastly, we'll talk about high performance computing, or HPC, and how evolutionary robotics really can utilize the massive amounts of resources that we have available, both at UCIT, but also in the larger context of Norwegian research. So Sachin, if you can jump, I think one more. Perfect, thank you so much. So what we're looking at here is an overview of the basic evolutionary algorithm. And on the left, we can see how the evolutionary algorithm goes through and optimizes to find the correct solution. And in the gray box on the right, I've sort of tried to highlight the box named evaluation so that we see a little bit about what would happen inside that. But let's start on the left and focus on the algorithm as a whole. So when an evolutionary algorithm starts, we start by creating a random population, usually, that where each of these solutions are one way to solve our problems. And they're usually random because we don't know a lot about the problem to begin with. We don't know the correct solution, because if we knew, we wouldn't use an optimization algorithm. Next, we take this population, we evaluate it to see how well they solve the problem. And before we talk about evaluation, I'll just go through the rest of this algorithm. After we've evaluated all the solutions, we check if any of these solutions are able to solve our problem. So that's the termination criterion. And if none of the solutions are good enough for us or actually solve the problem, then we move on to selection. And selection and variation are where you can see the biological inspiration of evolutionary algorithm. So in selection, we select a number of solutions from the population, very much in the spirit of survival of the fittest. And we take these solutions, we apply some variation operators to them, like we can mutate them, we can do crossover to combine solutions to create a new solution. And then we start all over again. It's important here to note that selection is stochastic in nature. So we don't just take the best solutions, but we usually do some sort of random selection weighted by fitness. So usually fitter solutions have a higher probability of joining the next round of evaluation, but that's not a guarantee. So we've now seen that how the evolutionary algorithm sort of moves around. It goes from creating a population, evaluation, selection, variation, and then evaluation again. So what do we do in an evaluation? Well, usually in an evolutionary algorithm, we have a genome, or a bit string is what I've illustrated with here. We take this bit string and we convert it into our phenotype, which is a representation of our solution. And we do this, we have this two-step approach, this genotype phenotype divide for several different reasons that we won't get into today. But it's still an important mechanism in an evolutionary algorithm. We then take our solution, we put it into an environment. If it's in the robotics domain, we let it do whatever it's supposed to do. What's illustrated here on the slide, it's trying to navigate a maze. And then once the solution has run its course, maybe we give it 10 seconds to solve the maze, for instance, we see how well it did. And we get a single fitness score out. And that's also an important thing to notice. But I'll summarize the most important parts right now. Sachin, if you could. Thank you so much. So the key takeaways from the evolutionary algorithm is that we have a population of solutions. And that's a really important factor because very few optimization algorithms outside of the biological inspired ones actually do this. Usually you optimize a single solution. So you can, for instance, do simplex optimization, where you have one solution that you always try to improve by sensing the gradient, for instance. The other important, another important point of evolutionary algorithm is that we have crossover and mutation, which facilitates the optimization. So crossover and mutation are usually tailored to the problem at hand, or at least to the genotype phenotype that you have at hand. And we're able to optimize solutions through these variations operator, but they are also able to facilitate exploration, which is very important. If you've ever done optimization, is that you need to both optimize and exploit the good properties of solutions that you already have, but you also need to explore. And this exploration together with a population of solutions enables us to solve a lot of difficult problems, as we'll soon see. Another interest, one back, Sachin. Sorry, yeah, thank you. Before we finish with this slide, as I noted, the genotype and phenotype distinction is very important because you can do a lot of very interesting research around this, because you can have genotypes that are not exactly the same as the phenotype. You can sort of emulate what happens in human, where the DNA in our cells is a very, very long description, but it's not it's not a complete description of how our arms should look, for instance. And so we can do this sort of interesting compression stuff with the genotype-phenotype distinction. And the last thing that I'll point out is that the evaluation takes into consideration the whole episode. So in the maze example, for instance, our evaluation just gave us the fitness of how well it solved the maze, not how well it did during the maze solving. And that's also an important property, as we'll see right now, Sachin. Perfect, thank you. So why then are evolutionary algorithms so interesting? Well, one important factor of why evolutionary algorithms are so good optimizers is that they don't use gradients. So this comes back to the whole episode evaluation. So instead of having to say, for instance, for a traveling salesperson problem, you want to find the shortest path between a number of cities, which we've illustrated here on the slide in the bottom picture. And we could do a greedy approach and say, always go to the next closest city, but that doesn't guarantee us finding the optimal solution or the best solution. And because evolutionary algorithms don't require a gradient to solve the problem, we don't need to explain to the evolutionary algorithm how to solve these intermediary steps, which is a nice property. It's also often easier to define if a task is completed or not. So for a traveling salesperson, it's easy to say, well, we found a shorter route than what we already had, but the intermediary steps there are really difficult because we can say when a temporary path is longer than the best one, but up until that point, we don't know if we're going in the right direction. So it's easier with evolutionary algorithms to define just a task complete. And the last and really, really most important point of evolutionary algorithms is that they have multiple solutions. And with these multiple solutions, we are able to escape local minima. So for instance, if you find a solution that is really, really good at solving the problem, but not the best one, that's a local optima. And so by having these multiple solutions or multiple ways of getting to the problem, you still have a possibility of getting out of these local optimas. In addition, with multiple solutions, we can also have multiple objectives quite easily. And that's another thing that evolutionary algorithms are really strong, are really suited for. And that could be, and we'll see an example of that in the next slide, but multiple objectives comes back to when you have competing interests. So maybe you want to design the strongest link for your robot, but it needs to be cheap as well. And that's not something that you can often combine really easily in a single fitness evaluation function, because for something to be strong, it probably needs to be made of a lot of material, but then it becomes more costly or heavier if that's another objective that you're interested in. So being able to select a trade-off there is something that evolutionary algorithms are really good at. In addition to the last point, and that's something that evolutionary algorithms just recently started exploring, is since you have multiple solutions, you can also have different ways of solving the same problems at the same time. And I'll show you an example of that now in the next slide. Thanks, Sachin. Perfect. So what we're looking at here is a research paper, and I should have mentioned this earlier, but these small squares in the bottom right, in the bottom left corner, are references to the papers that I cite. So you can easily go and check up on this. But what this research paper basically did was we want to design a wing shape, and we wanted to give us the maximum amount of lift possible. And in the figure that you're looking at here, we can see a lot of different wing shapes. The color in the figure shows the lift capacity. And all of these small individual cells that might be a bit difficult to make out in this figure are different wing shapes or wing solutions to this problem. And what's really interesting here with this evolutionary algorithm is that we are able to evolve all of them simultaneously. So you get all of these different wing shapes, and what you can then do is you can select the best. Maybe you need the maximum amount of lift for your new plane. Well, you can simply go in and select the maximum amount of lift. But if you need different set of trade-offs, you can then select a different wing that better fits those criteria. So maybe you're designing a windmill, for instance, and you need the largest surface area. Well, you can then evolve a set of windmills that fit those criteria. But if you use the technique that we're seeing here to creating multiple solutions to the same problem, you can maybe then also evolve windmills that are small and thin. And then for your next project, well, you need the small and thin windmills. We already have that. Perfect. So that's the strength of having multiple solutions. So that's why evolutionary algorithms are so good. Let's go ahead and look at something that's a bit more not so straightforward. So, sorry. So in this slide, and I've called this surprise, and I hope you see why. In this slide, I've tried to illustrate how you would measure the height of a robot when it's jumping. So to measure how high a robot jump, you can take the point connected or touching the ground when you start, and that's the blue half square that you can see at the bottom of this robot. You then let the robot jump, and you measure the highest point of this blue half square, and that's how high the robot can jump, right? So let's say we use this as our fitness function and try to evolve robots. You would expect to get pretty much what you're seeing on this slide, right? But no, surprise, Sachin. So this is the exact fitness function that the researchers that created this small little GIF here used. So the lowest point of the robot, you take that as the initial point. You then see when that point is at the highest, and you get a jumping robot. But what evolution has found here is that if it just makes this pole vaulting robot instead, it gets a really, really good result, because the lowest point gets really tall up in the air. But you wouldn't exactly call this a jumping robot. It's at best a falling robot, if we're really kind to it. And that's the sort of surprising stuff that you get with evolutionary algorithms. And I see that we'll jump a couple of slides ahead. Sachin, if you could go to the antenna slide for me. So surprises are not just a bad thing in evolutionary algorithms. They can also be a good thing. And what I've illustrated here is NASA in 2006 had a competition to design a new X-band antenna. And on the left, you can see their reference design. The rod in the middle of this ground plane is about 5 inches long, while an evolved antenna, the small little thing that you see on the right side, came out through evolutionary optimization. And the super interesting thing here is that the small evolved antenna had much better performance compared to the reference design antenna, in addition to being much, much smaller. As you can see, the small little, I think it's a dime here, is probably the size of the rod, the diameter of the rod. And so you can see that evolutionary algorithms can both be frustrating in that they will exploit any opportunity they can to circumvent what you actually wanted to get out of things. But that same property also leads to really interesting solutions that humans don't usually think about. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to evolutionary algorithms. Let's next move on over to modular robotics. If you can jump a bit further ahead. Perfect, yes. So let's talk a bit about modular robotics. So modular robotics is basically what it says on the tin. We have robots made up of modules. And what's interesting about that is that we can create robots by doing very much a Lego combination. By first creating a bunch of these building blocks, we can then put these building blocks together to create a robot. And I've illustrated that here with a robot that we actually used for my research. So the picture here shows one of the real movable joint modules of the robot. And then on the right, you can see an evolved robot, which is comprised of these movable joint modules. So the yellow and green modules on the right is actually modeled after this real world model. And what this gives us is we're able to create realistic or real world modules, but it's also really easy to recreate in a simulation. And it also gives us an opportunity to have heterogeneous models. So we can have, for instance, sensor modules and movable modules and stationary modules, which is really nice property. Let's try to illustrate this one further of why this is so interesting. So next slide, please. Perfect. So I've here tried to illustrate the spectrum of robots that change their shape. So to the far left, outside of this picture, we would have robots that doesn't change their shape at all. So robots such as Spot, which I think many of you have already seen, would be to the left of this figure. So it doesn't change its shape. But then we have robots such as the one that you see moving here, which is called Dyra, coming out of research of a colleague of mine from the same research group at University of Oslo. So Dyra is able to change the length of its legs and is then capable of changing its morphology to test doing different tasks based on what is needed. Then in the middle of that, we have modular robotics, which we can comprise of these real world modules, but we can still create a bit more interesting body shapes compared to Dyra, which will always be this four-legged version of itself. And then to the right of that again, we see a different research project also out of the same research group, where instead of having these pre-built modules, you can instead 3D print the modules to get what you want. And so these are all part of the same spectrum of robots that are able to change shape. And that's interesting because we can then design the robot for the task at hand instead of taking the robot and trying to make it do tasks that we don't want, that it doesn't want to do. So how have I done this in the research that I've done? Perfect, Sachin. We're getting the hang of this. So what we usually start with in evolutionary robotics is that we have a single module that is our starting initial point. Our random population can be a single module or a random combination of modules. And then through mutation and crossover, we can grow these robots. But then the difficulty, of course, lies in changing the shape of the robot at the same time as trying to optimize the control, because a lot of these robots, we don't know how to control them. Like the three robots that we see on this screen both evolved its shape and control at the same time, because I have no idea how one would control these robots. They're quite strange, and as we'll see, they often control in different ways. But the focus of my research was on why is a diversity of solutions a good thing? And we started to test this by evolving these robots on a flat plane. And then we wanted to transition them into different types of terrains. So next slide, please. So we compared 3 different evolutionary algorithms, the columns of this figure here, on how well they evolved fast-moving robots. So we said to these 3 algorithms, the only thing we want from you is fast-moving robots. And as you can see, the evolutionary algorithm is what we call it, the leftmost column, was able to find the fastest moving solutions, but it didn't find a lot of different solutions. So in the top row, you can see the result of a single run of evolution. So you can see there that the evolutionary algorithm is able to find fast-moving robots, which is shown by the coloration. So the more yellow or the higher yellow color shows faster-moving robots. Then in the middle, we said to a different algorithm, we want both fast-moving robots, but we also want different types of robots. And so you can see that it's perfect, Sachin. It's able to find more diverse robots, but it's not able to find faster moving robots. And then in the third column, we used an algorithm specifically designed to evolve different types of solutions at the same time. And so in the middle row, we can see if we take all the different runs that we ran, so we took the top row and redid that one 30 different times to get statistical significant data. And in the middle row, we then plotted which cells, so what type of different robots did the different algorithms find on average. So a higher yellow color in the middle row means X number of runs found this type of robot. So we can see that for the evolutionary algorithm on the left column, it's mostly finding the same solutions, and it's very concentrated in a small area of the search space. So it's not finding a lot of different exciting robots. The middle column is able to find more robots, but as we saw, it wasn't able to find high performing solutions. And this last optimized algorithm was able to find both solutions all over the place, but also quite high performing solutions. So then, what happens when we transfer these robots into different environments? So remember that they were evolved on a flat terrain, and then we created two different terrains, as you can see here, to sort of test these out, to test these solutions in these new terrains. So we sort of assume that the evolutionary algorithm will optimize for a flat terrain to move very quickly. But if we then put something in the way of this, we sort of assume that the motion won't be able to scale walls, for instance. So let's go to the next one, Sachin. So here we compared the transition to these multiple environments for these algorithms. And there's a lot of data to show in a single slide. But what we're looking at here is the top row shows the square environment that we just saw, and the bottom row shows this ripple environment that we just saw. And then the left column shows what happens if we just say to the algorithm, here is your population from when you evolved on the flat terrain, take this and continue evolution in this new terrain. And from what we can see is that only one of the algorithms were able to continue evolution to get higher performing solutions in these new environments. But then on the right column, the one with the cross on it, what we did was we took the population from the yellow algorithm from the flat terrain, gave that to all the algorithms and said, okay, start from this and then evolve. And the results were that they were all equally good. And this shows actually that diversity in and of itself is something that can help you solve a new and difficult problem that you haven't seen before. So remember, we started by evolving something in a flat terrain. We then introduced two new difficult terrains. And the algorithm with the most diversity was actually the one that managed to overcome this problem. So Sachin, if you can go back 2 slides for me. Perfect. So again, look at the top row here and see that the algorithm called MapLeads is able, or was able to, in each run, find a solution for all of the different robot types. And in these two new environments, then what this means is that since we don't know where in the environment a good solution could be. So it could be that we need a very, very large robot to overcome these obstacles, or a very, very small one that's jumping a lot around. That's difficult to know beforehand. So instead of saying, well, we'll solve that problem when we get to it, we instead say, well, having a lot of different solutions to the same problem can help us here. So how do these robots look? So we can go perfect session. So the GIF here is a bit slowed down, but here you can see one of the robots locomoting. And so it's kind of worm-like, kind of using a couple of limbs to move around and sort of toppling over itself. Quite interesting. We can look at the next one. And I had to zoom out here because this one was so fast when I simulated it. It's a bit slowed down in the GIF, but at least you can see this is moving in a completely different way. So it's toppling over itself. It's working like a wheel almost. So just to illustrate the interesting results that we get from these different robots. So we've seen a little bit about evolutionary algorithms. We've seen a little bit about modular robotics. Let's use the last couple of minutes to talk a little bit about high performance computing and how evolutionary algorithms can exploit parallel compute. So in my day-to-day job, as I said, one of the things that I help researchers with is to accelerate their computing by transitioning to GPU compute. And what that means is that we take a problem that the researchers are already solving on the CPU, and then we translate it to run on GPU. And if you've heard about machine learning, you know how much faster that is on GPUs. So you would sort of assume that we could do the same thing with these evolutionary algorithms. So what I've illustrated here is that we have a 4-core CPU, and we have this simulation of these modular robots that we just saw, and we want to speed this simulation up. So what you would then traditionally do is that you would split the problem into smaller regions, and you would then let each core of the CPU work on that. And so next one, such it. And we can do the same on the GPU. So the difference between the CPU and GPU is that modern CPUs have between everything from 8 to up to 128 cores, while a modern GPU has closer to 40,000 cores, at least the research GPUs that you're usually training on in large-scale HPC environments. So with these small cores, we should be able to divide our problem up into many smaller problems and speed that up. Unfortunately for us in evolutionary robotics and robotics research in general, it's not that straightforward. Because the robots are in effect so much smaller than the compute available, the physics is behaves a little bit different than machine learning in general, like deep neural networks. This is not the most straightforward approach. So in a sense, we can't really do this because we can't just take our simulation, divide it up into smaller squares and give that to something and expect speedups. It just doesn't work that way. So what can we do instead? Perfect session. Instead, we could go back to the CPU and say, well, since we can't really divide this problem up into smaller tasks, well, we can create more work. We can instead say, let's have each core run its own simulation. And that's quite straightforward. We can already do that. But we can take this one step further in an HPC context. We can divide the work up between nodes. So I'll illustrate this in the next slide. Sorry again. So what we're seeing here is that we've taken 4 nodes with 1 CPU each, and we've given the problem to these. But then, as we just saw, we're wasting a bit of CPU because we could split this further. And so what we've tried to illustrate here is that we can, if we have 2 computers, 2 different CPUs, we can both divide the experiments over each CPU. So we can take, so each core can do its own simulation. We can divide that up into the number of cores on CPU, and then we can divide that up over the nodes as well. And this is really nice because, as we'll soon learn, there is a lot of compute that we can do in evolutionary robotics. And next slide. Perfect. So again, we can divide this up over, we can let the different nodes work on this different simulation. But in addition to that, as we just saw, we can also divide this up depending on the configuration of the experiments that we're running. So instead of saying that all the nodes in the cluster needs to do the exact same experiment, we can say, well, let them do different experiments, as I've tried to illustrate here. So here we have 2 different CPUs that are simulating more or less the same evolutionary experiments. We're still evolving robots, but here we have 2 different configurations that we want to test. And that's also excellent for sharing between these big clusters. So let's do some quick napkin math so that you get a feel for how much compute there is in evolutionary robotics, but also how parallel computing can help us with that. So for the experiments that I did for this research that we've just talked about in modular robotics, we had 200 individuals in the population. So if you think back to our introduction to evolutionary algorithms, that random population consists of 200 individuals. And then we had that evolutionary algorithm loop that just went around before we went down to termination. And in my experiments, to give the algorithms enough time to evolve interesting enough robots, we say that we can do that 500 times. So we do 1 loop and then 1 loop and continue to do that until we've done 500 of that. In addition, you saw that we had 3 different search algorithms. And to get statistically good data, or to have enough data to be able to do statistical analysis of, we did 30 repetitions per search algorithm. So what does that equate to? Well, if you take 200 times 500 times 3 times 30, you get 9 million evaluations. And an evaluation here, of course, doesn't take the same amount of real world time as it does in the simulation. So we simulated 20 seconds, but that simulated 20 seconds takes about 5 seconds on average, depending on robot size and stuff like that, which equates to about 12,500 core hours. So what that figure means is that to run this experiment fully out with all the data that we want, we need to run 1 core for 12,500 hours, or roughly equivalent to 521 days. So if I had access to only 1 machine with 1 core, I would need 521 days to run my experiments. But of course, that's not how we do it when we have access to these HPC systems. So how much time did I actually use for one of these experiments? Next slide. Perfect, Sachin. Just 5 days of simulation. So from 521 days, if I had just 1 computer with 1 core, we condensed that down into 5 days, which is a good speed up, as you can imagine. So how can you do the same thing with the resources available? Well, Sabri already introduced the AI Hub, the ML nodes that you can already access. We have 6, soon will be 7 nodes, all with GPUs. with multiple GPUs per system. They are easy to access, shared file system, everything that should get you up and running quickly. And then once those resources become too constraining for you, you can move over to the larger national systems, which are under the Sigma 2 umbrella. And in Norway, we currently have access to 3 systems, the largest one being Betsy with 172,000 cores. So a lot bigger than my experiments. And so I think there's enough compute available for a lot of the research that you do. So I hope that was a good introduction to evolutionary algorithms, modular robotics, and how high performance computing can aid in that sort of research. And I think it's time for questions.
Yeah, thanks, Jürgen. I think it was quite stimulating. Maybe time was too short for a lot of detailed perspectives here, but somebody like me who doesn't know anything about it, I think it's probably a very good start. And I was just wondering if you have read this book by Pedro Domingos. It's called The Master Algorithm. He basically talks about different tribes in artificial intelligence, and maybe you are from one of those tribes, which is evolutionary algorithm. So my first question to you is that since there is so much division among AI researchers these days, that one goes for evolutionary algorithm and one goes for deep learning and one goes for whatnot. So what can, where is evolutionary algorithm, let's say, useful in application areas? So from you, we understand, of course, robotics is one such area. But have you also thought of other application areas where evolutionary algorithms are very useful?
That's an excellent question, Sachin. Evolutionary algorithms have actually shown potential in a lot of different areas of optimization, but where it's probably most applicable is for these NP-complete problems that we just briefly connected to in these slides with traveling salesperson, job shop scheduling, knapsack problems, stuff like that is where evolutionary algorithms really shine, where we can't in linear time find a solution, but we can evaluate the solution to the problem in linear time. And so that's where evolutionary algorithms really shine for the most part, I would say. In addition to, we're seeing a lot of overlapping concern. We're seeing a lot more work done combining evolutionary algorithms and deep learning, for instance. Something that's a really, really interesting topic is when you sort of take the best of each of these approaches and combine them together. So evolutionary algorithms are really good at, for instance, evolving the body in robotics. That's not something that that's done as much in deep learning because it's difficult to design the problem in a way for deep neural networks to evolve the body. But then control of robots is something that deep neural networks excel at and can be a lot better than the solutions that are usually employed in evolutionary algorithms. So combining these two together is actually something that we're just now seeing and is giving really interesting results.
Yeah, I think what I understood as a layperson is that navigating this hyperspace is where evolutionary algorithms probably offer a great advantage, whereas something like a gradient descent, and if we are, as you also mentioned, like looking for a surprise. So I think those antenna examples were really great. And I think that really stimulates my thinking because we all have been suffering because of COVID. And I was reading one of the news which said that Italian supercomputers found a molecule which is already approved drug, which they believe could help in treating COVID. So it's not a vaccine, but it's a molecule, drug molecule. And I'm wondering, maybe they must be searching through all the molecules through a similar evolutionary algorithm approach. And I'm also wondering, a lot of these drug research drug research related, drug discovery research probably uses evolutionary algorithm. Do you think so, or is that a correct assumption?
That's a very good assumption. I think I can't say whether or not they're doing that, but it's at least a very valid approach to finding such new ways of experimenting with it. I think for a lot of problems, evolutionary algorithms are not sought out because they contain quite a bit of stochasticity. So people are hesitant to use evolutionary algorithms in all of these areas. And the NASA antenna example is a really good example of this, because the NASA actually tested this antenna, actually took it up to the International Space Station to test the antenna, and saw that it had all the properties that were sort of tested on the ground already. But they still ended up on their next satellite mission to employ the same large reference design antenna. And that comes back to even if you prove something, when people don't like it or it's not intuitive, it might not be the solution that people go for. And that's also, I think, even more the case in medical research, where probably right now these news articles that you're reading are using some sort of deep learning, I would presume, because that's what's most advertised nowadays. But there is no reason why we couldn't do that with evolutionary algorithm, which is a really good insight by you.
But I think there is, I mean, just building on the same, how the virus will mutate, every country is worried. And if we replace your modular robots from the virus, I think probably you can also simulate, what are the probable, proteins that in the coronavirus, for example, and probably we can already predict. I think there is similar research happening probably in some places in US. I don't know if you're aware of, or if something UIO is doing in this direction, because this could be very interesting and relevant for current times.
Absolutely, indeed. And I think with the availability of all the compute that we have now, that we've illustrated some of that already, you can do a lot of these collaborative studies to sort of get that, because a lot of evolutionary algorithms require more compute than others, but is really excellent at utilizing parallel compute and using all that parallel compute to do stuff like what you're suggesting now. For instance, looking at how the virus could mutate is something that evolutionary algorithms could excel at. I don't know of any research groups at UIO using evolutionary algorithms for that, but I at least hope that if anyone in this Zoom are connected to UIO and are interested in this, they hopefully will reach out to me and I'll send them to professors that are currently working on evolutionary algorithms to continue in that direction.
Yeah, I think there is already interest in your work. I can see there is a comment from Mr. Chris Noorani about your work. Maybe you could connect to them offline. And there is also one question here. What are the different multi-objective solutions on Pareto front and trade-offs used when using NSAGA second?
I assume that this Q&A question is wondering about what sort of multiple objectives I used in my research, because that's the only mention of NSGA2 that we've seen. So for my research, I've used speed, so just velocity of the robot as one objective, and then the difference, the inherent difference between the current robot that you're evaluating and all the other robots in the population as the second objective. And the second objective can then be further subdivided into two different objectives, in that you can have difference in the number of movable modules and the number of non-movable modules to more or less simulate what Mathletes, this third algorithm specifically designed to do multiple solutions, is already doing. So that's that was a way to sort of compare these two algorithms on more similar grounds, which I hope answered the question.
Yeah, I hope so too. And thanks, Jürgen. We are already 2 minutes over the scheduled time, but I think it was a wonderful conversation that I could have with you. And I'm sure that there is a lot of interest, as we already discussed, that this high performance computing probably offers much more than simulating robots. And I think people can leverage your experience and use the USIT resources in future. So I think maybe we have start of something good today with this. And as Sabri also mentioned that this has been going on in past, but I think now you are having a much more community inclusion approach. So maybe more wider people can benefit. So I would like to thank you at this moment for taking out time and sharing your valuable insights and work, and also thanking Sabri and class for sharing their time. And we look forward to continue this AI lunch. And if I can say already, we are planning the next one on June 15, but we will come back with the exact announcement later. So I think we can conclude here. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you again.
So should I end it, class?
Yes, the